fine. Thank you so much for being with me. You must be extremely busy as well.
Yeah, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be depressed if I had nothing to do with my time. So it's good being busy, but no, it's good to have an opportunity to chat, and looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. Do you want to state your pronouns before we begin?
Unless it's not clear from my the facial hair I'm currently sporting.
Um, well, actually, let's just start
Yeah.
with you introducing yourself to my audience. What's your story? Tell my audience who you are and how your story came to light these past few years, which I imagine is the same way I discovered you via X.
Yeah. James Esses, currently practicing as a psychotherapist, and have recently founded an organization called Just Therapy, which is basically therapy for people who don't want woke therapists that are going to push certain ideologies on them or judge them because of their sex or their skin color or their religion. Trying to bring back neutrality and ethical practice to therapy. It's been a long journey to setting this up, which began now 4 years ago when I was doing a master's degree in psychotherapy, and I was kicked off my course because I spoke out against what I saw as the ideology, the gender ideology that was taking over the profession. I raised concerns about children being put on irreversible medical pathways for what is a mental health condition. And I started to speak and write about this, and I lost my degree because of it, essentially. And I spent the last few years embroiled in litigation trying to seek justice.
Yeah, and it's I mean, what was your political background at all, if any? Like, do you feel that you've embarked on this journey now and being very vocal about all this, and it wasn't something that interested you to begin with?
Well, I've always had strong views on things, and but on the trans issue,
Yeah.
that wasn't something that really occurred to me. But as far back as it did to some people, because I just wasn't really involved in that world. And, I would occasionally read about things in the news, but back then it wasn't very widely reported on. It was only when I started training in psychotherapy, it was only once I was counseling children and seeing firsthand the increasing numbers of them who are wanting to, well, stop their puberty from happening and try and transition to become the other sex. And I thought, hold on a minute, this doesn't seem ethical. Therapy is meant to be about exploration and resolving discomfort in the mind, not changing the physical body. And I decided to read more about it. I read a variety of books. I was reading research papers into the impact of puberty blockers and such like. And I just thought I had to speak out about it. I felt compelled to do so. I thought I was doing the right thing as an ethical trainee psychotherapist. I thought it would be appreciated that I was raising my essentially concerns about child safeguarding. But the response I got was really quite different.
Was it surprising to see your peers react that way? Was it a majority of your peers?
Well, the decision to expel me came from the highest levels of the institute I was training at. It was the CEO and the deputy CEO and the board. So they made that decision behind closed doors. But in terms of the reaction, I kind of hoped that my peers, who I'd gotten to know very well and on a very deep emotional level as well, because psychotherapy training is quite intense in that way. I thought more of them would come to my defense, actually. I thought they might take a stand and say we shouldn't be kicking off one of our peers who's hardworking and clearly passionate about pursuing this vocation. We shouldn't kick them off because of their viewpoints or opinions on things. But they all stayed silent, essentially. And
Oh, wow.
it's really quite sad. And in the years that passed, I had some students from the same institute reach out to me in confidence, telling me that I had their support. I even had some academics from the institute reach out to me in confidence, saying that I had their support, but none of them are willing to say so publicly. And I think that's it's quite telling. It tells us the kind of environment, particularly in academia at the moment. People just want to keep their heads down so that they're not the next one to lose their degree or their job.
Do you feel that there's a certain shift? I mean, the question that comes back often with these interviews is, have we passed peak woke? Is there a return to some sort of normalcy? I know that many different countries experimented with gender affirming care, if you will.
Mm.
And here in Canada, I mean, we're considered Wokistan, and we often look to Scandinavian countries, like, oh, look what they're doing over there. And then suddenly there's some backpedaling and there's some admitting that perhaps we went a little too far with some nonsense. What's the situation in the UK right now? And do you feel that people are coming out also with your gained popularity? Like, are people coming out and speaking out? Is there a vibe shift, if you will?
There's a lot more spotlight on the media, the mainstream media finally uh, reporting on this. Although I wouldn't say necessarily reporting accurately, because we still see language based on ideology rather than reality. So I'm forever reading stories in UK media about female rapists. And of course, females, at least in the United Kingdom, cannot commit the offence of rape because it has to be a man with a penis. But they'll refer to people, including convicts, with their preferred pronouns. And I think that's the height of journalistic dishonesty. Nonetheless, these issues are still being spoken about more often. It's come up in the political debate as well. We're kind of at a bit of a halfway house. I mean, the government recently announced what they're calling an indefinite ban on puberty blockers, which means that children now can't go to a clinic or their GP and ask to be put on them at the moment, which sounds like a big win. And it is a step forward, but there are a lot of loopholes. For example, the government are planning on doing a clinical trial on puberty blockers for potentially unlimited numbers of children. So children will still be given this medication. Similarly, those who are already being prescribed puberty blockers can continue to receive them. So it's better than it was, but it's still, frankly, not good enough. And the problem is our legislation. I mean, I know Canada's in an awful state. When I look at Canada, I feel positive about the United Kingdom by comparison. But I mean, our legislation is in a complete and utter mess, because our current laws in the UK allow for the notion of somebody to legally change their sex, which is a complete nonsense. And our laws specifically protect discrimination against people with different quote unquote gender identities, but that has been allowed to essentially force women to have to share their toilets and other same-sex spaces with men. So I can't see how we can ever get back to a state of normalcy until we've actually essentially revoked bad legislation, but I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Mm. If actually, I'm just going to ask the simplest question I can think of for many people who aren't really invested in these issues and everything. But what is gender dysphoria? Because I've had Buck Angel on the show and I've had Helen Joyce, and
Yeah.
It's always surprising when you hear it the first time that is gender dysphoria a mental illness? And our kids, when we talk about the self contagion,
Mm.
the contagion going on socially. Is this like kids basically self-diagnosing on TikTok? Is it like wanting to be part of a victimized group?
Mm.
I'd love for you to elaborate on all of that.
Gender dysphoria is the term that's evolved over the years. It's a recognized mental health condition under the various diagnostic manuals and tools that are used around the world, like the DSM, for example. And in the UK, if you want to quote unquote transition, you have to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Now, there's debates over whether that diagnosis is adequate and whether it captures really what's going on. But what I can say is, from my perspective, that believing you're in the wrong body hating healthy parts of your body and wanting them removed altogether, not wanting to proceed with your natural puberty, is indicative of mental ill health. This is not a normal way to think. And it's got commonalities with other types of mental health condition, like body dysmorphia, for example. People just have this severe hatred towards a part of their body. Even connections with things like eating disorders, anorexia, all the rest of it. Convincing themselves that this part of their body just doesn't align with how they truly feel inside. So it is a mental health condition. It's not an identity. And this is part of the problem. We've sold this myth to children, particularly through education, that you can identify however you want, and that gender is this distinct notion from sex. And you should identify how you feel inside, and maybe you feel more like a girl, you feel more like a boy. Children need to be taught that it is impossible to be born in the wrong body, and that there is no such thing as transitioning to the other sex, and that if they are feeling such a level of discomfort in themselves, that needs to be addressed through exploration, talking therapy, even just time. The passage of time is very important with this. I mean, we know how difficult puberty is for children, particularly young girls. It's quite common for children not to want to go through it when they see the changes happening. They're confused. All of a sudden, their body's shifting, and then particularly for girls, the way people and their peers are viewing them is also shifting. And a lot of unpleasant, I guess, side effects that come along with puberty. But the message needs to be from parents, from teachers, that we've all been through this, and at the end of the day, you will be okay. Not, if you don't like going through puberty, here's a silver bullet to just pause it altogether. So I always want to think of this in the context of mental ill health rather than identity.
How do these ideologies capture people's minds? Like, what actors do the woke mind virus, if you will, benefit?
Well, there's a lot of money to be made out there. And I see in the UK huge numbers of organizations offering training and offering to come into schools and talk to children, or even go into workplaces and train their staff in things like DEI and microaggressions and all of that stuff. Huge moneymaker. Because we've seen the explosion of DEI generally. I mean, it's almost unheard of now to have an institution that doesn't have a DEI policy or a head of DEI role in it. Similarly, from the medical perspective, again, huge money spinner. And I've done some exposés on some of these gender clinics, both in the UK and abroad, and making huge amounts of money off performing these double mastectomies or phalloplasties or whatever you have, essentially, mutilating healthy parts of someone's body. And so if they can push the notion that actually what matters is how you feel inside, and sure, we'll sculpt your body to align with that, well, then they're going to have a never-ending stream of clients coming to them. I think some people are doing it because they think it's the kind thing to do, and they're trying to right the wrongs from the past. This is the problem, because I've got an issue with the LGBT movement in general, and the adding on of the T to it, because there were, of course, historic injustices around the world in relation to people because of their sexuality. And I think people are so afraid of history repeating itself and so desperate to be seen as good, progressive people that they'll essentially appease anything. And that's exactly what we've seen with the adding of the T to that acronym now. So I think it's a kind of toxic combination of a multitude of factors there. But I don't know. I think the biggest problem I've realized is that you can present people with truth and facts, and if they're ideologically motivated with a sense of almost religious fervor, it's not going to make a blind bit of difference. I mean, we had an independent report commissioned by the government in the UK into gender dysphoria and to treatment for children, and it was very, very clear when it said that there's no basis for puberty blockers, that they carry significant risks and such like. And the activists that I saw online essentially rejected the report outright, on the basis that the author of the report was a quote unquote cisgender person who doesn't have quote unquote lived experience of being trans. So what can you do with these people?
Yeah, you've posited that cis is a slur, which apparently got Elon Musk's attention because he's been saying that as well.
Yeah,
What's it like having Elon interact with your posts? Like, is the attention a lot to handle? I can only imagine someone with 200 million followers retweeting you or reposting you, re-Xing you must be a lot.
I'm surprised my phone has actually withstood it, to be honest, with the amount of notifications that were coming up. But I mean, that post in particular, I think it ended up being viewed 100 million times, which is great. I want the message to get out there. I want people to be engaging and talking about this stuff. I get a lot of abuse for it as well, and inevitably, when I post something about rejecting the term cisgender, I'll get direct messages from various activists with blue hair and pronouns in their bios calling me a sissy and a sissy bitch. I get that one quite a bit, and kind of memes saying like a tissue box and saying like cis tears and things like that. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense, really. But it is a slur. I stand by it, and actually, it's funny because I'm essentially mirroring what they're doing. We often hear the other side saying, don't dead name me, don't misgender me, you must respect my identity and my pronouns. And I turn around and say, okay, well, in that case, you must respect me. And I don't believe that cis is a term. I don't believe there's anything as cisgender. And so don't refer to me as cisgender. And they tell me, but you are cisgender, whether or not you like it. And I say back to them, point proven. It doesn't matter what we think about ourselves. There is an objective reality out there. You don't get to dictate what other people say to you and how other people, refer to you. So it's I'm very happy that Elon's on board with this, and he's helping to generate publicity for the cause as much as possible. Um, I mean, the States, I think, now is about to turn a real corner with Trump getting in, because he's already essentially pledged to uh, eradicate the gender madness, as he calls it. So I'm actually a bit jealous, because we've got a government over here who I just don't trust.
Hmm. Let's get back to your practice.
Mm.
And I'm really curious, being a parent myself, do you have advice for parents whose child has expressed, being uncomfortable in their own body or their desire to transition even? I mean, it's one thing to call these things out, and then it must be quite surprising and heartbreaking to experience this.
100%. I speak to so many parents. I really feel for them. They don't know what to do, and it's an utter minefield. And it feels to them like one misstep, and they could essentially lose their child forever. And it's not scaremongering to say that. I've heard the stories of children becoming completely alienated from their parents and essentially falling into the arms of these activists and their groups. It's almost cult like. When I speak to parents, I always talk about the need to try as best as possible and strike a balance, which is very, very difficult to do. But if you push back too strongly, then your child will turn into themselves. They won't feel like they can talk to you about it, and you could end up pushing them further into the arms of people with malintent. But equally, if you appease them because you just want them to be happy, well, then they could end up going down this pathway and quite often end up regretting it and facing irreversible regret that they can't go back from. So I think trying to strike the right balance between being an authoritative, solid figure who's there to tell their children the truth about the world and reality, but also empathizing and actively listening to that child, and showing them that you get how difficult it is. Because for these children who genuinely believe that they're in the wrong body, I can only imagine how horrific it is to have that dis-ease in yourself day in, day out. So I think parents need to be empathetic towards it as well, to avoid their children essentially just switching off from them altogether. It's very, very difficult. As I said earlier, even the research has shown that actually it's just the passage of time that heals this more than anything. If that's not working, then explorative therapy is an option, and I do have parents who reach out to me and my colleagues, and we'll speak to their children and their teenagers, and try and explore these things and consider where these feelings of discomfort have originated from, what their options are going forward. And again, my role as a therapist isn't to tell children or any client what to do. It's to explore, gently challenge, open things up, um, rather than just nodding along and affirming them down whatever pathway they want to go down. But it's very difficult. Even as a therapist, it's very difficult at times. And one of the core aspects of therapy is this notion of bracketing, which is essentially setting aside your own personal beliefs on things and just viewing the client as an individual in front of you. But when you've got young clients who are wanting to go and essentially leave themselves mutilated and infertile, it does stir something in you. But again, as I said, I've learned that telling people what to do never works. They have to make their own decision.
Sounds like a whole lot of parents acting like children and the other way around.
Yeah.
Um, do you see this, because you mentioned the word religion, you've said cult. Do you see this social contagion as filling a void, perhaps that God-shaped hole in a mostly secular society? And it has promoted these past, I guess, couple of decades. Is woke a religion?
Well, it's got its acolytes, and it's got its preachers, and it's got its kind of series of commandments that you have to follow. So yes, I would say that it is. I think the point you make about there being a void is an interesting one, and I've thought about it a bit. And I think really what we've generated is a society of people who are narcissistic and self-obsessed, to put it bluntly. And now the people who've fallen out of love with religion on the whole, and I think fallen out of love with the sense of community as well. Actually, everything's become so individualistic, even the way social media is going. And I look at the younger generation, I look at how obsessed they are, how they want to portray every element of their life online, their obsession with taking photos, not of things or happy moments, but of themselves. I think it's all created the perfect storm, actually, where identity is king. And so that's what's happening now. These children from a very young age are being told that identity is everything. And so they're left now with the question of, well, what do I identify as? Because historically, children weren't thinking about what sex they were. It was simply luck of the draw, you're born as you're born, get on with it. But now, even in primary schools, they're being taught there are unlimited numbers of genders. And for a child who hasn't experienced the world yet, it's not surprising that they're coming out and saying that they identify as X, Y, and Z, because children feel things very, very intensely, and they haven't yet developed the neurological functioning to kind of take a step back and really consider things in the round. So, and the problem is for children, again, once they've set their mind on something, it's very difficult to get them to deviate away from it. I mean, children can be convinced of all manner of things. We know that. Appreciate I've gone off on a slight tangent there, but yes, I do think that there's a real void from where religion, and also I think outside of that, just generally family and community, even the family unit and the way in which that's kind of disintegrated over recent decades also concerns me.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I'm starting to see it, and I've had certain guests on the show mention that there is a counterculture. There is a younger generation, even more, who just thinks that all of this is very cringe and very like just see their parents engaging with it, trying to be on the right side of history. And I'm wondering if you observe that at all in the UK.
Pockets of it. I take part in some national events which are to do with debating and open dialogue, and I see teenagers there and university students come out in support of free speech, and that gives me some degree of optimism. But on the whole, no, I don't think so. I think generally children are going to believe what they're taught in schools. Um, I actually think there needs to be a complete reset. This is very cynical of me, but I genuinely worry about it. Sometimes I think there needs to be a complete reset, and that we've almost lost a couple of generations to this, because the children coming out of schools and then being pushed out of universities, having had years and years of essentially being indoctrinated in this stuff, I think the vast majority of them are probably lost to it, and they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. And I worry that when they're in power, even if we make some advancements now, they're going to row it all back all over again. We need to root this stuff out at its origin, which is why, for me, education is probably the most important place and the most important battleground in all of this. So I do see an element of counterculture, but I think it's a minority.
I've seen you ask this question on X, and I'd like to ask it back at you. Do you lose respect for a person after discovering that they have pronouns in their email signature or online bio?
Yeah, I do. I do. Um, and maybe I'm being too judgmental on that, but it's how I feel. And from the responses I got, it's how many people feel. And I lose respect either because they're essentially following what I've said is a kind of dangerous cult. So I do have to question people's frame of mind, and I guess even intellect, if they're going to follow that. But alternatively, even if they're doing it to just quote unquote be kind, I also judge that because they're making life far more difficult for the rest of us. I appreciate that we're living in times of cancel culture and infringements of free speech, and I will do whatever I can to work with people to give them the confidence to speak out about these things, even if it means being cancelled, because we need to create more momentum with this. But so I get why people are resistant to putting their head above the parapet, but they've got to do it for the sake of us all. So when people are being kind in that way, I'm also judging them for us. If be completely honest. There was a there was a case I reported on from the UK a week or two ago about this therapeutic body, and the CEO of that body was found to be following Tommy Robinson, who's this, for some of your listeners who don't know, he's well, a lot of people essentially label him as this far right figure. They would say he's anti-Islam, he's anti-immigrant, all the rest of it. But he's been reporting on the grooming gangs that's been going on in the United Kingdom over recent times. And whatever you think about the guy, this CEO was just following him on Twitter, had liked, reposted any interaction with him, just followed him, and it was discovered by some of the members of this organization that the CEO was following him, and they ended up launching a massive investigation that lasted 6 months, and they ended up forcing him to publicly apologize for following Tommy Robinson on X, and he completely capitulated, and he issued this complete and utter apology, saying that he was promising to do better in the future, and he apologized for the hurt it has caused his members. And I was looking at this guy thinking, you've made your life for the more junior members of your organization so much more difficult now, because if they get in trouble with the thought police for following the wrong person on X, what can they do other than prostrate themselves and apologize? So people need to take a stand on this. I really feel that way.
What's the latest developments with those grooming, if I may say, rape gangs,
Yeah.
Pakistani rape gangs? Again, Elon was very vocal about this. It's something that has resurfaced. What's the
Yeah.
reaction been now that it's been a few weeks in the UK? How could this even happen is crazy. I mean, I'm reading Douglas Murray's Strange Death of Europe right now,
Mm.
and he talked about this in 2017, Ayan Hirsi Ali. It was out there. People knew this, and it seems like the media, the police force, just everyone was complicit and not saying a
Mm.
thing. Can you just draw a picture? I mean, there are people around me who have no idea what I'm talking about when I bring it up.
Mm.
Maybe perhaps draw a picture of what the situation is, what happened, and why is it resurfaced recently.
Well, the situation is that there's been, yes, you said rape gang, some people refer to it as grooming. I mean, it's certainly a combination of the two, but essentially these gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani ethnicity, were sexually abusing, raping, grooming, trafficking young British girls around the United Kingdom. We don't know the true extent of it. I think it's safe to say that it's in the thousands of girls. It could be even tens of thousands. We just don't know. Um, and there was a public inquiry into child sex abuse a couple of years ago that the government announced, but that was a very broad inquiry that was looking at abuse that was going on within certain celebrity culture. It was also to do with what had happened in the church and abuse that happened in that context. So these gangs made up a very, very small part of it, which is why there's now increased calls for a new national inquiry into the gangs themselves. The causation, in part, is clearly because of the migration system that the UK's got, and people are rightly questioning now whether we are letting the right kinds of people into this country with this who share the same values as we do in Great Britain, and clearly not in the case of these Pakistani men. Secondly, I've been reflecting on the impact that the whole woke DEI culture has had on this. I've actually got a piece coming out on this next week because people are now terrified of being labelled as a bigot or a racist. And as a result, there are concerns that police, social services, other public bodies essentially didn't do the job they're being paid to do because they were too afraid that if they pointed the finger at a certain ethnicity or religion, that they would come in for criticism, which is really quite concerning. We've actually seen that occur in other contexts. So there was your listeners may be familiar with this. There was a bomb that went off in Manchester Arena a number of years ago when there was a concert taking place. I think it was Ariana Grande was actually performing in Manchester, and this Islamic terrorist let off a bomb there. And when they were doing the inquiry into it afterwards, one of the security guards said that he had seen this guy looking dodgy, fidgeting, sweating, and all the rest of it, but he didn't want to say anything or call him out because this guy was of clearly Muslim origin, and he didn't want to get it wrong and be offensive and essentially be accused of being racist because of it. And so he essentially did nothing. And that is terrifying, that people are so scared of being labelled as a bad person that even safeguarding adults and children comes second to that. So I have no doubt that that has contributed to these rape gangs in the United Kingdom as well. We need to stop putting offence and people's feelings above child safeguarding.
That's crazy. What's the situation with free speech in the UK as well? I've seen videos where people are getting arrested, for Facebook posts or X posts, and it's like straight out of an Orwell novel. Just the police coming in and arresting people for what they said on social media. And I'm bringing it back again, if I can follow up with a second question. But how important, how significant was the purchase of Twitter in 2022 by Elon Musk?
Yeah, the situation with free speech is really quite fragile. I don't think we've got proper free speech protection in this country, to be honest. And this government seems to want to row back on it. There was a legislation passed by the last government to protect free speech in universities and protect students like myself from being cancelled. They've essentially rowed back on that and removed any legal recourse that students would have. We've still got something in this country called non-crime hate incidents, which means that the police can still investigate you even if you haven't committed a crime, which is absolutely backwards. That really is something out of an Orwell novel. So free speech is not in a good state here at the moment. Elon's decision to buy X is, I think, it's going to end up being one of the most consequential decisions of this entire debate because he has restored free speech to that platform. And we've seen now other social media platforms, even Facebook, seeming to follow suit, actually, which has been very good to see finally after all these years. But some people are saying X has become the Wild West and there's lots of unsavory characters on it. And I don't disagree with that. There's a lot of people with some horrific views out there, but I still would rather they had the free speech to be able to voice those views than being shut down. Um, so I think it's been huge, really, and I'm very thankful that he did that. Um, and the Labour government in the UK seemed to want Elon to essentially stay out of our affairs, and I don't agree with that. I'm more than happy for him to be involved and to pass comment and judgment on what's happening in this country. He's an extremely intelligent, successful person, and as I said, I'm jealous of the United States with Trump and his administration, which includes Elon, in terms of the great work they're clearly going to be doing. And I just wish we had more of that over here in the UK.
Why is Trump a net positive?
Because I genuinely believe that he's going to clamp down on this stuff once and for all. I think that if there is this culture war that they talk about, I think he's genuinely going to go and now win it in the United States. And I think it's badly needed, because actually the UK has been ahead of the US on certain points. You know, even in terms of this gender ideology, and given that how much of it is done on a state by state basis. Um, in terms of what children have been exposed to in terms of medically transitioning children in parts of the states, it's been really quite horrific, and it was pushed by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And some of the stuff they were putting out during his presidency was really quite worrying. And Kamala Harris, you know, sharing her pronouns before important public meetings, and we're just going to get the complete opposite with Trump. So I'm very pleased to see that. Um, it's going to be very interesting to see how this government deals with a Trump government. I can't picture it. I'm trying to picture Keir Starmer, our prime minister, having a conversation with Trump, and I cannot see it. The fact that Nigel Farage has a better relationship with Donald Trump than our prime minister is quite telling.
Yeah, and it seems, I mean, people are so confused. You mentioned Zuckerberg and kind of following in X's footsteps with the community notes and
Yeah.
getting rid of third-party fact checkers. And around me, what I witness is just people not understanding. I mean, the media is complicit in this as well, where they'll just have a headline saying fact check, fact checking eliminated. So people are now upset and want to leave Facebook because now there's going to be a community note system, which they don't understand, because obviously there's way more people on Facebook than X, and they haven't witnessed the community note system, which is far superior in action. And it's just like I just see people completely getting it wrong, not understanding what's going
Mm.
on. And I mean, no wonder everyone's mixed up when it comes to pretty much every issue, which is strange to say. Like there's not one single issue, and I thought even October 7th would have kind of like rallied everyone together and say, okay, that's bad, right? It's pretty simple to differentiate between evil and good. And
Mm.
then suddenly the next morning, to my great dismay, it's once again the world completely upside down.
I agree. I we're living in such polarized times. It's that's not that I'm not even commenting on some of the wars that are breaking out. I'm talking about in the Western world where we've got supposedly peace and democracy. So polarized. Um, I think social media has probably contributed towards that in some way, but I think people have felt very badly let down by the governments over the years, particularly here in the UK. People feel like they're not being listened to. People feel like they've had things imposed upon them against their will. We've seen that, whether it's the migration, whether it's other forms of kind of woke ideology. Um, it's not good. And I do worry about it. We've seen elements of it kind of break out into more, um, I guess, visible and dangerous discourse. And even we've seen elements of rioting in the streets and violent protests in the UK. And I'm not saying this to try and pass judgment on one side or the other, but I'm just making the point that people are very clearly aggrieved with what's been happening. And I don't know what it's going to take to unify society. I don't know if it's even possible now, but I think we
Hmm.
need it.
Do you, I mean, because it happened yesterday, do you have any thoughts on this ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas?
I mean, I'm always happy to hear of any ceasefire if it means some reduction in potential loss of life. If
There's
you
the
need,
hostage situation as well, obviously. That
yeah, the hostages is also, I mean, I don't see how you can move forward until that entire hostage situation has been redressed. But I do worry with these ceasefires, and I've seen them in the past, whether it's basically just putting a band-aid on a gaping wound. And I get something big is going to have to change. I don't know what it's going to take. I mean, I've got my own thoughts on it, but something's going to have to significantly shift, because otherwise you're going to end up in this never-ending cycle of aggression, retaliation, global condemnation, and then reset all over again. So it's just not tenable for anyone. I mean, this is really not good for the Israelis, nor indeed those resident in Gaza. So I don't know. What are your thoughts?
my mind is completely blown just by the fact that a deal um, has, what is it, 30 terrorist prisoners for one hostage, dead or alive. I mean, it seems so self-evident. And once again, I turn around and I have once again the contrarian opinion with my peers and friends, and it's so bizarre, so strange. I've had so many people, so many guests on the show, and we've discussed this at length. And I mean, obviously, I'm a massive Douglas Murray fan. I've read everything by him,
Mm,
and I feel that the most prominent intellectuals in the space, from Peterson to Douglas Murray to Barry Weiss to Ayaan Hirsi Ali to Neil Ferguson, like everyone seems on the right side of history. But then when it comes to the general public, people seem confused. I feel Hamas is winning the PR war because they're willing to sacrifice their own children and civilians. And I so much thought, so many thoughts, so much to say. And then again, what can you say? Because it's just everyone's in their echo chamber. They see dead babies, and then they form their own opinion about the thing without having all the information, or at least trying to strongman the other side.
mm. Look, I come from a Jewish background. The circles that I've been in, and I know the strength of feeling there, and I've spent a lot of time in Israel myself over the years. It doesn't particularly guess us anywhere, but I just, on this issue, I just feel an overwhelming sense of sadness. I don't care which side I'm looking at. When I'm seeing any civilians fearing for their lives, when I'm seeing any footage of innocent people dying, being raped, whatever, I just think it's so terribly sad. I just wish it were different, but this is the problem. What's going on there is it's kind of like a proxy for people's discontent around the globe. I mean, I come from Ireland originally, and if you go to Northern Ireland, you go to Belfast, you see Israeli and Palestinian flags flying outside the houses. And the first time I saw that, I was completely confused. I didn't know what the hell's going on. I mean, we're nowhere near the Middle East. What's happening here? And then, it was essentially explained to me that the nationalists, the Catholics in Ireland, consider themselves similar to the Palestinians because they feel like, in the way that Israel invaded uh, Palestine, so too do the British invade Ireland. And so their sympathies reside with the Palestinians. And similarly, the Unionist Protestants align themselves with the Israelis in that respect.
Mm.
So it's the fact that you can be in Northern Ireland and find Middle Eastern flags flying tells you just how strongly people feel about this issue. It's almost like they're kind of internalizing it and projecting their own issues onto that conflict. But overall, people are very misinformed for sure, and it's very easy to just say you support one side or the other. And I think if you go to most of these protests and you really dig into it, I don't think most people know the truth of what's going on in the ground out there. So I don't think the rhetoric that's often amongst the public in the Western world is particularly helpful. I don't think it's getting us anywhere. It's just causing more polarization in our own countries. As I've said, I've seen some of these protests in the UK, some of these Palestinian protests, which have ended up getting quite violent and also abusive towards Jewish and Israeli people. And it's again sad that we're importing some of that mayhem and madness over onto our own shores.
Well, again, it's what's really mind-boggling is the use of vocabulary, and we've talked about it when it comes to gender-affirming care. Like everything is very well disguised, and
Mm.
then to be using the word genocide when it's the other way around, and like everything's upside down, and it's really exhausting to discuss this when the other side has just invented a language. Um, I'm really curious to know your thoughts before we go about. I imagine you've read Jonathan Haidt and Abigail Schreier's most recent books. Um, what do you think of? I mean, we talked about social media, we talked about echo chambers. There are different platforms that have different value systems, even like X being all about freedom of speech and sunlight being the best disinfectant,
Mm.
and then other platforms that were more censored. I witness it with my content as well. When I from TikTok to Instagram to X, like even the reactions are different. But then when we talk about children, as you do muchly, and looking out for them, what are your thoughts on Jonathan Haidt's thesis of just eliminating social media until the age of 16 or even 18?
I support it. There's been a call for banning smartphones in schools in the United Kingdom. I also support that. Um, I speak to parents and they say, well, we can't. All my kids' friends have got them, so how can they be the outlier? And we need to move away from a place where it's the outlier, which is why I think actually changing the law in this space is probably a good thing to do, because then parents can't be criticised by their kids for treating them unfairly. It's a blanket rule that applies to absolutely everyone. But social media, smartphones have not done anything for these children. I even when I think about my parents' generation, who were well into adulthood when all this tech truly took off, I see the way in which they're engrossed and obsessed and addicted to it. And if that can happen when your brain is already fully developed, you know, God only knows what it's doing to these children. But as I said earlier, I want to move away from this idea of self obsession and narcissism. You do see elements of it on even platforms like X, people being very grandiose about themselves and their opinions and all the rest of it. But you see it more on TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat. Like I said, this never ending selfie culture, I think, really does concern me. But no, I support limiting social media usage and smartphone usage for these kids. I think it's the way that we've got to go. But it's so difficult because we're so reliant on all of these gadgets in our day to day life, and the way in which even technology in general has been integrated into the classroom. I think it's going to be a challenge, and sometimes I long for the days when all you had was some crappy little brick phone that could only send an SMS. It's great how connectable we are with people around the world. It's great how quickly information can flow from country to country, but I think from a therapeutic perspective, I think it's not done our mental well-being any good at all.
Are you optimistic at all?
um, I really, I don't know. I like to believe that goodness and truth wins out overall, but I think history's shown that these things go in cycles. I'm optimistic that there will always remain good people to fight the good fight, but I can't say. If you ask me how I'm feeling about the next decade, I can't say overall I'm feeling too optimistic.
Unless you look at unless you look at Trump in the U.S., from what I
Well, I'll be
understand.
very interested. And like I said, that's actually when I woke up on the morning of that election, I did actually feel a sense of optimism, at least for America, that I haven't felt in a long time. So I'll be very interested to see what happens there over the next number of years. And hopefully I'm proven wrong. I really hope it is possible to change these things for good. But it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot. But again, when you've got someone like Elon Musk, essentially the world's most powerful man, I'd say, actually, in his own right, and possibly the world's most successful man, when you've got him championing these causes, that does give me some hope.
It's madness that even like a figure like RFK Jr., what he's saying about health, just making people healthy again. And people will pick and choose something that he's said in the past, or, his stance on vaccines, but they're not focusing on what probably was a left-leaning view for a very long time, just about, not trusting big pharma and
Mm.
perhaps making the food healthier like it is in Italy, or even here, the difference between Canada and the US. There's chemicals in the food in the US that we don't have here. And I thought, once again, that was generally a good thing that we could all rally behind. And it seems like, again, it's the world's upside down, and let's just focus on something we disagree with. Bad news seems to generate more clicks. It seems to generate more interest, and that's like the kind of nihilistic society we live in these days.
Well,
Optimism is passe.
it is. We've got guilt by association, and people, if they've got a single opinion that you don't like, it's you can almost regard them as a kind of the enemy. I mean, I've seen it myself. We saw it here with Brexit. Actually, I mean, there were friendships, relationships, families splitting because of which way they wanted to vote on Brexit. Gone are the days when you can just respectfully disagree with someone and still remain their friend. I think for me that's probably the most worrying thing of all. Actually, I'd like to get to a place where people can have differences of opinions, even very strongly held opinions, and still remain amicable and even potentially friendly at the end of it. I'd love to get back to those days.
It's a muscle to develop. It's so hard. I mean, even being conscious of this, I find is it's more and more difficult. I'm reading Marcus Aurelius right now because I'm just trying to get into this zone of, just control what you can change and what you can do in
That's
the
it.
best way possible. But I can't thank you enough for your generosity, and I really appreciate meeting you. And just keep fighting the good fight, brother.
Thank you. Nice chatting.
Peace.